From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Good Sunday afternoon. Welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Kate Walsh. It was a controversial project, another natural gas pipeline running through parts of western Massachusetts. The energy company responsible, Kinder Morgan, recently announced suspending plans for the Northeast Energy Direct Pipeline. People were concerned about the destruction of protected habitat and some of the state's most scenic rural communities. But now energy companies that wanted to bring more natural gas to New England must look for alternatives. So this week on 22 News in Focus, we look at how this will affect energy supplies in the state and more specifically to our region. We'll be talking about energy programs for both the public and government sectors and implementing strategies for the future of energy in Massachusetts. Our panel of guests are directly involved in the planning and implementation of energy projects in Massachusetts. So starting on my right is Catherine Rattay, the principal planner for the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. Next to her is State Senator Ben Downing. He's the chair of the Joint Committee on Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy. And to my left is Rick Sullivan, the CEO of the Economic Development Council of Western Massachusetts and the former State Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And Jim Hunt is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Community Relations for Eversource Energy. You all have very long titles to your names. So thank you all for being here today. First, we're going to talk about something that people are familiar with because it's been in the news lately and controversial, Kinder Morgan. So I don't know who wants to begin with this, but whoever wants to take it away, what was the importance of Kinder Morgan from your perspective for Western Massachusetts, if you thought there was an importance to it?
Well, I mean, I can go. I mean, I think that there has to be an understanding of exactly where energy comes from and the fact that, you know, while ISO New England has said at least through the summer we're fine, there is a reality that there's a lot of generation that is going to be going offline in the next 5 to 10 years. And there's an issue of reliability and costs versus where we're going to get the energy from and how we're going to get it. So Massachusetts has worked extremely hard taking the coal and oil-fired facilities offline. Most of the nuclear, at least in Massachusetts, will be offline shortly, and as will Yankee in Vermont. There does need to be a replacement of that power someplace. So I think in terms of just the realities of reliability, I think that was what the project brought to bear. Obviously, there was a whole lot of other issues involved in that, not the least of which were the environmental ones and protected lands in Article 97. But nothing about energy is easy. For every yes, there's a but, no matter what we are talking about. So I think as a community, and I mean that in the largest sense, we have to decide what we are going to support for our energy future.
What was the PVPC's role in all of this?
Right. So the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission and our sister regional planning agencies, the Franklin Regional Council of Governments and the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, we've all been working together with our partners at the state and federal government to think about the energy future for the Pioneer Valley and all of western Massachusetts. And we were neutral on the pipeline. Our goal is to bring parties together to have a conversation to understand the environmental impacts, the economic impacts, and make sure that we don't go backwards with respect to improving the quality of life for our region.
And how about at the state level?
I think at the state level, it was a matter of, does the project align with our stated goals? Massachusetts has been a leader when it comes to making the transition to a clean energy economy, transitioning away from fossil fuels. And I think there were significant and legitimate concerns about whether or not the project would make us too dependent on natural gas. It's absolutely better than oil and coal. No one will disagree with that. The question is, would it lock us in too much natural gas? And I think along with some of the other issues that have been cited, that's one of the concerns. But we also know we need to find a way to strike that balance between what we want to do when it comes to climate change and costs in the short term.
And where does natural gas as a resource stand in comparison to green energy, wind power, hydroelectric power? It seems pretty clean, right? Are there any negative effects of it?
Well, at Eversource, we have to plan for our 3.6 million customers across New England, and we do operate in a regional grid. So what's important for Massachusetts may affect Connecticut and New Hampshire as we plan for that grid. We do need more gas for our customers. Eversource was not a subscriber to the Kinder Morgan NED project, But we have partnered on another project called Access Northeast, developed by Spectra Energy. And that's narrowly tailored to meeting that generation need that exists today. Enough gas on existing pipelines, 95% existing right-of-ways, to meet the 5,000 megawatts of gas-fired generation that our customers depend on today. If you think about it, in the year 2000, just about 15% of our generation fleet was powered by natural gas. Today, we've had a dramatic shift. We're nearing 50% of electric generation, so we're largely dependent on that. But we are working with the legislature and other policymakers in the Baker administration to ensure that we have a diverse portfolio, adding hydro, adding wind resources, adding other renewable energies as we make the transition that the senator spoke about.
And why is natural gas so important? Why are so many people switching to it from 15 to 50%?
Well, the switch was largely driven by policymakers in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was one of the pioneers to move to a cleaner burning fuel, reducing emissions, not just carbon emissions, but other particulate emissions from dirtier coal and oil. And if you think about it, we've made a dramatic shift in our greenhouse gas emissions. We've already met the state's target on the electric sector for reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 25% in this area of generation, largely due to that transition. But we need to make the longer term transition as well, and that's what we're working on with Ben and other policymakers.
And I don't know if you want to answer this as well or if someone else wants to step in, but is there any impact on the environment when natural gas is burned off?
Yeah, I mean, there absolutely is, right? First of all, we should be clear. Every form of energy has an impact in one form or another. And all of us know about that for various projects that have been proposed throughout Western Massachusetts. So there's always going to be an impact. It's a question of what is the least impact that helps us meet our needs, right? And we can have disagreements about how we get there. I think the most important thing right now is what are we doing to continue to build on the progress that we've made? Yes, it's good that dirtier coal and oil plants have come offline. What can we do to bring online more renewables, right? Because while natural gas is cleaner than oil and coal, it is not clean, right? And certainly there are impacts throughout the process. And the smartest thing we could do is increase the investments that we're making in efficiency and conservation to reduce the size of that pie overall. That's the win all around, right? And there's a lot more that we can do there. We're first in the nation, but we should be building on that as well.
And I think it's important to point out that, really in the last couple of years, for the first time ever, ISO New England, which monitors and runs the grid, and their only job is to make sure it's reliable, recognizes the energy efficiencies and the demand response and now the renewable clean energies that are coming on board. And it has made a real difference. And that energy efficiency is working, particularly when you look at the summer months. We don't do much better than we do when we start talking about thermal energy. But it is, for the first time in the last few years, really showing up as being impactful.
And so before we get into all of these new ways and all these projects that are in the works for clean energy and the move towards clean energy, I do want to take a step back and talk about ISO New England and how that all works. A lot of people don't really know how the natural gas comes into their home, or where it's from, and also how it's created into energy that Eversource uses, electricity. And so how does that work? Who wants to go into the basics? We have about a week to talk about this. So no.
How about if we, kind of in a nutshell, ISO New England really monitors and the grid for New England. And their real only job is to make sure that there's a reliable source, so that when you go on and you flip on your light switch, your lights go on, or you turn on your heat goes on. And they certainly monitor where those sources of, where's the source of generation. So they look at the hydro and the gas-fired and the oil and the nuclear, and they put that all together and say, yes, there's enough energy coming into the system to meet the demand. They also have recognized the fact that, over the next 5 to 10 years, there could be up to about 8,500 megawatts of power that is going to retire from existing generation. That needs to be replaced from a reliability point of view. So, what you replace that with becomes the policy decision that I think everybody else here is talking about. But ISO New England does not generate any power.
Right.
They don't bring it into your home. That's up to people, like Eversource, in terms of bringing it to your home, and the generators who make it, or who are all different parts of the industry. But what ISO really is looking at is just the reliability factor.
They monitor all the input and output, that kind of thing.
Yes, and I'd add, you think about our dependency on gas today. This is an existing dependency. 50% of our generation is now run off of cleaner burning natural gas. ISO New England, in their planning for the last few years, has actually run a winter oil program to ensure that the lights and power flows, particularly during that peak winter demand time when home heating needs and industrial needs are drawing off the pipeline system. That's why we need this additional pipeline capacity in the region to power our generation. Otherwise, the unintended consequence is that we're burning dirtier oil plants in that winter peaking time, increasing emissions and increasing costs. The price volatility in our winters has been dramatic. We saw a 40 to 60% increase in electric bills last winter. Thankfully, in the summertime, the prices go down. But our customers, they don't like that up and down impact. They want to see more stable, predictable pricing, and that's important for our economic competitiveness as well.
All right, so we're going to take a break and we'll be right back, and we'll talk about clean energy, and I also want to talk more about setting the rates and everything else when it comes to natural gas and other energies. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about the state of energy right now and the future of sustainable energy in Massachusetts. So before the break we were talking about natural gas and the pipelines, all based off of Kinder Morgan announcing that they were going to postpone their project, suspend their project for now. So we hear a lot about the Department of Public Utilities, the DPU. They regulate natural gas rates, electric rates, right? So could you talk about how these people are appointed, who they are, what they did to have this experience, and how much they regulate when it comes to our bills each month?
Well, it varies a lot. So I'll speak for the last administration. There can only be, of the 3 commissioners, and there are 3, only 2 can be from the same political party. So there is a party diversity there. And really they can kind of come from anywhere. You know, 2 of the individuals, when I was secretary, 2 of the individuals, in fact, were not from quote unquote the industry. They were much more policy minded, and they kind of came from that world. In fact, one of them had previously served as the undersecretary for the environment. The other one had served as the undersecretary for energy. And then the third person is somebody who has a deep background, and she is still actually Westbrook is still on the commission now. She has a deep background, particularly in gas. But it is a highly technical and it is a regulatory function. And as you said, they do have they hold hearings and they do set the rates, and many times they reduce the requests that came in from the utility or put other requirements on the utility in terms of where those investments can be. It is really not a policy setting agency. It is really a regulatory agency.
And we are regulated by the DPU and interact with the DPU on a regular basis. The DPU, I think, has gotten much more sophisticated in various issues over the years, working both under the Patrick administration and today under the Baker administration, focusing on issues like grid modernization, making our electric grid more resilient to storms, introducing new technologies. And they've also worked on complex issues, national issues like cybersecurity. So the current DPU, the commissioners, they've come from a wide variety of backgrounds, and I think that diversity of backgrounds helps address issues in the public sphere.
Sometimes from the customer's perspective, it seems like the DPU can be the bad guy for setting the rates higher, you know, in the winter, summer, when there's more electricity used, and of course there's the reasons for it. But as someone who represents, you know, your contingency in Western Massachusetts, your constituents, what do you do at the Statehouse to make sure that they are being fair?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things we can do, and I think to varying degrees the DPU through stops and starts has tried to do this, is simply this: just get out in the areas more, right? Get beyond your offices, have public hearings so that people can provide their input and so that people understand the variety of complex issues that the commissioners are weighing. There's no way that all of us are going to support every decision that they make, but people should at least be able to see and understand why they're making those decisions. And increasingly, as Jim referenced, those decisions are more and more important. we're talking about not only changing the nature of what we use, but changing how people interact with their energy use, trying to modernize the grid so that all of us have more control over the energy that we use, how we use it, how we program our devices, so that we can get more benefits directly to customers. We need to get beyond sort of big, broad, sort of the bureaucracy that we've had in the past and come up with a more modernized energy infrastructure. So their work is going to be even more and more important, and they need to get out in the community more to do that.
And so, do you have any say over their decision making at all, kind of like lobbyists, or do they do everything behind closed doors as that 3-member body?
No, we don't have say over it, and quite frankly, I'm not sure if you'd want to have the legislature setting the rates. But I do think that we have an oversight function. We have tried to be rigorous with that, but understanding full well that the DPU has their role to play. I should say this too, compared to other states where the DPU's sister agencies operate, they have been more responsive here in Massachusetts than in many others. And there is a little bit more of a natural push and pull between the legislature and the DPU here than in other states where they operate completely beyond the public's view. So there's more we can do, but we are in a far better position than many other states.
All right, and before we switch to green energy, because I know that's the main topic here today, I just have one more question about DPU. How are they appointed? You said you were involved in that process.
Well, ultimately, the secretary does appoint the commissioners. I mean, in the big picture, everyone serves at the pleasure of the governor at the time, but those appointments were directly made through the secretary's office on behalf of the governor.
Okay. All right. Now let's move on to green energy. So we're talking a lot about solar energy right now and wind energy. What kind of projects are in the works right now when it comes to making this area more green?
Well, the Pioneer Valley and our sister agency, the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, we were leaders in terms of developing the first regional clean energy plan in the Commonwealth back in 2008. And we set very ambitious goals for achieving a percentage of our energy generated from clean, safe, sustainable sources. Right now, solar is really taking off. Solar, when we last assessed it in 2012, our region had more solar per capita than the rest of the Commonwealth. And again, I think that speaks to the benefits of planning. When you plan for something, you're more likely to achieve it. And so we've been very successful in achieving our goals toward a clean, safe, sustainable energy future with solar projects. Holyoke, Northampton, Springfield have some of the largest solar installations in the Commonwealth.
So your involvement is with the city's planning of these projects?
Right. As a regional planning agency, we work with our municipalities as our primary constituents and their residents, but also with community development corporations, obviously with our state and federal partners, with housing authorities, with community-based organizations to achieve consensus, because as we've said, there's pros and cons of every energy source, and every energy source requires the process of creating it, whether you're manufacturing a solar panel, mining the silicon that goes into the solar panels, whether you're figuring out how to release the natural gas from the earth, from the dinosaurs that created it, you're going to be producing carbon emissions in that process. So we've worked to achieve consensus on what are the criteria, what do our residents want to see in the kinds of energy, and the commitment is we want energy that's ready to go, we want to create jobs for the region, we want to capitalize on region money that stays here, and that work has been very successful.
What are some of the downsides of solar energy? We hear the benefits, obviously it's greener, but what are the downsides?
Yeah, we at Eversource, we're the largest integrator of solar in New England, and in fact, we've have our own solar facility that we constructed here in Springfield. So we've been bullish on solar and advancing the state's programs. I think on the downside, there's a couple of things. One is the intermittency of the resource. Solar produces just 15% of its capacity factor. And you can't predict when it's going to be there. So, we could have a cloudy day or 4 o'clock in the dead of winter when the greatest strain may be on our electric grid. Solar isn't necessarily there when we need it. I think in the future, as we add storage in, that's going to help solve that problem. And then today also the issue of cost, and this has probably been the most controversial recently in the policy discussion. Solar is a high cost resource, even as you compare it to other renewables, 2 to 3 times the cost of wind, for instance. So we think we need a more competitive process on solar, and the legislature has taken some steps to reduce some of the cost. and continue to invest in those most cost-effective clean energy resources. First and foremost, energy efficiency. For every dollar we invest in energy efficiency, we get a $3 return on that investment.
Yeah, and I think, Western Massachusetts really does have some real leaders, particularly from the business community. Mass Mutual, Big Y have really stepped up and done a lot with solar on their facilities. But just like everything else, you said, where's the opposition there? There are visual impacts, there are land use, conflicts. So we did change, recently, we don't incent the big, huge open fields or protected lands or farmlands the same way that, a top of a building or a top of a landfill is incentivized. That can be done through public policy. But there is those conflicts. If you live near a large solar array, or quite frankly, even if it's coming into your neighborhood, people do oppose that. So there is no absolute perfect answer to the energy solution.
All right, we'll continue on solar energy right after the break. A lot to say this afternoon. We'll be right back.
I was going to say.
You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about clean energy and long-term energy plans for Massachusetts. We were just talking about solar energy, and there's something called net metering, another confusing topic for many people. So can you explain net metering first and then talk about the controversy around it, I suppose?
Sure. I mean, I guess in its simplest form, right, net metering is one of two programs that the state has. It is not just a solar program, although solar is the predominant resource that takes advantage of it, and it requires the utility company to purchase back the energy, the excess energy generated at a site, generally on a rooftop, but certainly in some of the larger projects that we've seen as well. It's required then that energy is purchased back at a higher rate. In most cases, although this has changed a little bit in law, that's at the full retail rate. And the challenge, like many of the things that we've talked about here today, has been how you pay for it. And I think everyone agrees that the way that we pay for solar and for distributed renewable resources, generally, the way we're doing it now isn't the right way. It is programmatic, it is stop and start. It does not get us all of the benefit out of the resource that we would like to get. I think the way that we ought to go is taking a broader view and thinking about how do we create markets for these resources. It's something that New York is trying to do. It's something that California is trying to do. That makes a lot of sense, but how we get from one rate structure to the next is tricky, both from a policy side and from a political side. And I think it highlights a bit of the earlier conversation about why those appointments to the DPU are important and about why it's important for the DPU and other agencies, regulatory and policy making, to get out into the community and say, here are the benefits, here are the costs, how do we weigh those, and how do we move forward?
Would you guys all agree with what he's? Yeah. All right, there's another debate going on, energy efficiency. It's over energy efficiency. You guys were all talking about during the break, so let's start up again. What is the controversy?
Well, usually energy efficiency is definitely one, at least in its, easiest form, is one that everybody absolutely buys into. And Massachusetts, for the last 5 years, has literally led the nation in energy efficiency. But to pay for some of the energy efficiency programs, those dollars are paid by the utility payers when they pay their bill. There is a small part of that bill that goes towards those energy efficiency programs. So there is this argument of people shouldn't pay for these programs. They don't like paying for it, so that's a controversy. And then where those dollars, where they come from, and then who the beneficiaries of the energy efficiency programs are, don't necessarily match one-to-one. So it's not a perfect system, not without some critics. Again, just kind of going back to, while I think everybody here is all in on the energy efficiency programs, not absolutely everybody is. So nothing is a program without some critics.
And it should be said too, right? Those energy efficiency programs, we've been first in the nation in Massachusetts for some time, thanks to the partnership between the legislature with the utility companies and with local communities all coming together to take advantage of these programs, right? But I think the question is, what are they going to look like moving forward? Some of our biggest savings have been on lights and other fixtures that at some point actually aren't going to cost or aren't going to count towards the savings that we're achieving. So how do we incent customers to use energy smarter and to reduce the amount that we use? And all of this ties together, right? It's the how do we set rates? How do we get smarter with these programs moving forward? Because for too long, our economy has been on autopilot when it comes to energy. We might be frustrated when we see those bills, but then we just pay them. Instead of engaging and saying, how as consumers can we get more bang for our buck? And how as policymakers can we create the framework for exactly that?
Well,
and as far as energy efficiency, as Rick Sullivan was saying, that some people aren't taking advantage. MassSave is the state utility program that all the utilities participate in. MassSave.com. You can just go to that website, and you can have every homeowner can have a no-cost home energy assessment, and then receive $2,000 worth of improvements, insulation, air sealing. Businesses, municipalities can also take advantage of no-cost assessments and significant, very reduced rate improvements to make their buildings energy efficient. So that's a huge opportunity that everybody should be taking advantage of. And again, the energy efficiency, the cheapest energy is the energy we don't use. So the cheapest energy is the energy we don't use. So everybody should be taking advantage of MassSave.
And we've had some great successes on energy efficiency. It may sound counterintuitive to have a utility advocating for conserving more energy. But we pride ourselves on our energy efficiency programs. Take, for instance, our 3-year MOU with Mayor Sarno here in Springfield. We worked with the city to look at all of their buildings comprehensively and to find ways to save through these programs. Similarly at UMass Amherst and throughout the region here in Western Massachusetts. But that MassSave program for our residents, everybody should do it. Get the free home energy audit, get the insulation, and it will pay back over time and continue to put money back into your pocketbooks. As
a company that wants to make money, why do you care about how much people save?
Yeah. Well, again, I think this is how Massachusetts has really perfected the model through the work of the legislature, through the work of the administration. We've developed programs to incentivize energy efficiency. And so that helps us help our customers. We are in a high-cost energy state. We're one of the highest-cost energy states in the nation, and energy efficiency is one of the best ways that we can help our customers save.
And thinking about that, right, even though we have high per kilowatt hour costs, our average bill is actually in the middle of the pack when it comes to states. And the reason for that is investments that we've made in energy efficiency and policies that the Patrick administration and the legislature put in place to make sure that the utilities don't lose money while they're promoting energy efficiency. If we want the utilities to be a partner, and they have been a partner in particular on this, we can't be asking them to partner in something that will hurt their bottom line. By making it so that it doesn't hurt their bottom line, we have a broader coalition coming together than we've seen in other states where there's been a lot of political wrangling and quite frankly, not the progress that we've seen here in the state.
So incentives to the energy companies, how about incentives to businesses?
Well, I mean, I wanted to say that the Green Communities Act that the legislature adopted in 2008 included a program called Green Communities Certification for municipalities. And a municipality, the legislature was, I mean, incredibly insightful in creating this program because they looked at what are the barriers to clean energy siting and generation and development in our state, and they incentivized overcoming all those barriers. So they said each municipality has to develop a plan to reduce their municipal energy use by 20%. They have to streamline permitting for siting of clean energy generation. They have to adopt an energy efficient stretch code. And those are the things that were preventing us from moving as quickly forward as we have since then towards a clean energy future. So we, in Western Massachusetts, we have the largest percentage of certified green communities. Our communities have received over $11 million in funding from the Commonwealth to implement these reduction plans, and that means all those municipalities have reduced their municipal energy use by 20%. So we are really leading this, and again, it's thanks to the legislature and the state for creating programs like this that really educate residents. Oh, if our municipality can do it, then we can do it. So the whole leading by example has been huge across the Commonwealth.
And it's great for the overall economy too, right? If you look at the job impact, right? That in particular those investments in efficiency, but also the investments in clean energy have had across the state. You're talking about nearly 100,000 jobs across the state in clean energy and clean tech. And while the economy everywhere else cratered, those jobs are going 5 and 10% a year, upwards of 15% a year. And in some of the sectors that were hit the hardest, when people in the trades were losing jobs because the housing market fell apart, they were getting jobs doing energy efficient upgrades at municipal buildings and residences, working on solar and clean tech as well. So it's been a boon to the overall economy in Massachusetts to be a leader on clean energy and climate.
A whole industry that didn't exist a decade ago.
That's true. We'll talk more about clean energy right after the break. We'll be right back. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about the future of clean and sustainable energy. There are several communities that have their own municipal utilities. We haven't talked about that yet, and often we do talk about that on the news, at least in the winter months and the summer months, when the rates for these companies, these utility companies, vary from the larger ones like Eversource. So how do they work? Can you talk about that?
Well, I know historically there was legislation that made it possible for municipalities to create energies, and we do have a wealth of them in Western Mass, more than the rest of the Commonwealth. We have Holyoke Gas and Electric, Chicopee. We have Chester has one. Westfield, obviously. But I don't think it would be possible for somebody to create a municipal utility now. But my collaborators would explain.
So I mean, basically the reason for the difference in the pricing is for the most part it's the profit margins, because under the municipals they're limited in terms of how much they can actually take on the profit on the bottom line. So that's really where you see in terms of price. There's other benefits in terms of service and local service network that I would make an argument for are good. And for any community today, even though there is legislation that allows a community to go into the business of being a public utility for purposes of gas and electric, is going to be probably near impossible, because they would have to buy the assets of the existing company that's there, so the infrastructure, so the pipes, the wires, the poles, hugely expensive to do that. So probably the cost barrier to that is not going to happen. But you do have some communities that are taking advantage of that legislation and creating a public utility for the purposes of telecommunications. So you have a community such as Greenfield, where the mayor there is moving in the direction, and soon we'll have broadband type facilities, fiber facilities there in the community. So has taken advantage of the legislation to become a public utility, but not for gas, electric type services, but more on telecommunications.
So at one time, why was it popular, I guess, or why was it they were capable of doing it at one time? And
I think it was a time before the grids were largely built out, right? So I think it was a time where you were just talking about rolling out electricity into many communities. So you had more forward-thinking communities. And I think at this point, you aren't going to see, there's probably about a half a dozen communities in Massachusetts that would like to consider the process. And certainly there are some barriers to entry there as well. And it should be said that there are municipal utilities that are very good when it comes to renewables. There are some that aren't as aggressive at that. And there are many residents of those municipalities who would like to see more of the state programs offered in their communities. And we ought to do a better job of ensuring that.
And just on a point on the price differential that often gets lost in the conversation, is that the municipal utilities do operate very differently than the rest of the state system. So the requirements that may be on an investor-owned utility like Eversource don't necessarily fall to municipal utilities, and so you see that cost differential. We talked about energy efficiency. The costs and subsidies that go on the bill to subsidize the programs for energy efficiency don't always go over to the municipal utilities. So they have a cost differential based on some of the social programs passed in the legislature and through the administration that are avoided at the municipal level.
But they must have other requirements at the municipal level. Like you were saying, they become green communities, they have incentives to do that. So maybe it's not in people's bills for the utilities each month for those communities as it might be for Eversource, but they must have other ways of being, forced to have green solutions, right?
There really isn't a
No?
great deal. One of the argument from public power advocates is that local control will lead to programs coming up in those communities that want them, and there are some for instance, that have net metering programs in many ways similar to the states and have gone through a lot of the same debates. But there are many that do not, right? And there have been proposals in the past to require them to do so. Those proposals have been met with a great deal of pushback. I think I still have the scars to prove when we have proposed them from the committee level in the past. But we ought to come up with a framework that requires all of the communities to do so as well, and in a way that's consistent with public power values. I think we can get there. We haven't figured it out yet, but it's something that we ought to keep trying to work on.
All right, let's switch gears to wind power. It's popular in the eastern part of the state to some extent. How about out here?
Oh, what? I would even push back on that.
Okay.
I have a district that has more installed wind power than any other in Massachusetts. We have the Hoosick Wind Project in the towns of Florida and Monroe. You have the Berkshire Wind Project in Hancock and in Lanesboro. And then you have single turbine projects in Otis that you see on the Turnpike, at Jiminy Peak, and at Berkshire East. Now, most of those projects all of those projects actually have come along with public support. There have been plenty of other projects that have been proposed in communities and rejected. So I think the challenge within Massachusetts is siting, but I think broadly speaking, we know that wind is going to be a bigger part of our energy portfolio moving forward. And that's a good thing because it is both clean and cost competitive. And I think those two things together only lead us to believe that in New England, wind is going to grow as an energy resource.
But the downside is you have to have wind, right?
Right, and we just don't have a significant amount of wind capacity in the Pioneer Valley and Franklin regions. Obviously, they've made good use of it in Berkshire.
Yeah, we don't, I think with respect to wind power, I agree with Senator Downing. It's a great resource. It is an intermittent resource, but it's more predictable and has a higher capacity factor than other renewables. We're seeing capacity factors around 50%, so it's really come a long way in the last few years. The other challenge with wind is the resources aren't always necessarily where the load pockets are, either here in Springfield or in the Metro Boston area. So you have to spend more on transmission to get those resources into the market. There's a lot of wind resources up in Maine, land-based wind, but it's hard to get those resources down here into the greater Boston and Springfield area. Where we see a new potential is offshore. Massachusetts has some of the best offshore wind resources in the country, pretty far offshore. And what we've seen in Europe is the technology advance on offshore wind, deeper water wind. They're building in the North Atlantic Sea off of Ireland and Scotland. So I think that is a new area, and the federal government and state of Massachusetts are moving in that direction. And we think those price points are coming down as well. So in the future, that's the next frontier.
Interesting. And one of the downsides, I guess, of wind power is some people don't like how the windmills look, right? The turbines and everything. But what are some other downsides of it?
Well, the cost is the other one. I mean, I think that those were the two. I mean, if he has scars from some of the things that have come out of his committee, then, I got some of the scars of Cape Wind. That was largely opposed on basically two fronts. One was, being able to see it and the aesthetics and, disrupting other natural resources to be able to build it. And the other was the cost. It was definitely absolutely going to be more expensive, as quite frankly, any first leader new technology is always going to be. When flat screen TVs first came out, most people couldn't afford them. So whatever the first wave of the technology is going to be much more expensive, and it's going to be that really big expensive leader, if you will. But then industry will do what industry does best, which is they will make it much more cost effective. They will find better ways to build and deploy and stage it, and we'll get that cost down, as Jim was talking about. So I do think that there is a real opportunity for Massachusetts in the federal leasing program further offshore. Much of the opposition around it kind of disrupting people's site views goes away, and you have some of the bigger international players that are now very much interested, that really are leading. So the Danish energy company is here. They're one of the potential leasers and installers there. And as that costs come down and it becomes much more competitive, I think Massachusetts is going to be very well positioned in offshore wind.
And as I've mentioned, Eversource is the largest integrator of wind in New England, buying that power on behalf of our customers under current state programs. But we're seeing the costs really come down exponentially. Land-based wind is almost at par with gas-fired generation, efficient generation. The problem there is we don't have enough land, we don't have it at enough scale, and as I mentioned, it's harder to get that remote wind into the load pocket. But the offshore, what we've seen from pricing in Europe has really come down from what Rick talked about with respect to Cape Wind. The cost profile we're seeing is almost cut in half.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and we'll talk about hydroelectric power when we come back. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. We're talking about all different types of energy and sustainable energy in Massachusetts. We haven't talked about hydroelectric power. People at home are thinking, hydroelectric power, didn't they use that during the Industrial Revolution? I mean, the basics of water running machinery. So how does hydroelectric power in our modern age differ from that in the concept of it?
I don't think the technology actually has significantly changed, right? I mean, and it's interesting because it's the reason why many of our communities are where they are, in particular in Western Massachusetts. It's why Pittsfield is where it is. It's why we had so many paper mills dotting the countryside of the Berkshires. So the technology is not significantly different. It's just that the need has grown because we need those base load renewable sources of energy to blend in with wind, with solar, and with a more responsive modern grid. So while for a while hydro may not have been looked positively upon for one reason or the other, right now it is a massive part of the solution to build a fossil fuel-free economy and to reduce and stabilize costs across New England.
How reliable is hydroelectric power?
It's very reliable, which is why it's a great base load fuel, and it works very well with wind. And I think right now is a perfect time for Massachusetts to be moving into hydro. I mean, it's actually called for in the Global Warming Solutions Act plan in Massachusetts, calls for, originally it was about 1,200 megawatts. I think it really needs to be about 2,400 megawatts to hit those goals. But the transmission that gets built to bring the hydro in, which is a number of different sources. It isn't not just Hydro-Quebec. There are other sources in Canada. There are some in New York. There's some in upstate, probably Maine, that can come in. So right now there's probably about 6 different generation options out there that can all compete, which means costs can come down. And you've got a number of different transmission lines, which again, those transmission lines will also compete and bring the cost down and also be able to bring down some of the wind and other renewables into those transmission lines. So it is a perfect time from an environmental point of view, from a reliability point of view, and quite frankly, from a cost point of view to be bringing in hydro.
And it's not, like, as you said, it's back to the industrial age. Holyoke just received $1 million from the state to beef up their hydroelectric and to add 2 megawatts more of clean energy generation right here in Western Mass. So we already have the technology and we know how to do it, as Senator Downing said.
And it's large scale. So we at Eversource are working with Hydro-Quebec on a project to bring 1,100 megawatts of clean Canadian hydro into the New England grid. This will reduce carbon emissions by over 3 million tons of CO2 each year, and it will reduce costs in the region by $850 million each year. So it's clean, it's cost effective, and it's reliable.
Wow. But unlike solar energy where you can have it on your own roof, hydro would be on a bigger picture, right? Just like the grid kind of thing, not individually.
Generally, the projects that we're talking about are large projects,
Right.
although I do think there is a case to be made for the state as a whole to be doing more when it comes to those existing hydro facilities, legacy hydro facilities, that for one reason or another were abandoned. And we need to do a better job, and we need to partner really with our federal agencies to make it easier to redevelop those existing dams, to be able to distribute that energy locally as well. Too many of our manufacturing sites are near old dams, and yet the regulatory costs on the federal level of keeping those dams producing local clean energy are too high for the owners to be able to take advantage of. So there is potential both in the large scale and here locally on the small scale as well.
Why in the past, you were mentioning 2008, why in the past few years, decades, has there been all of a sudden a realization that we should go to clean energy? Shouldn't have this been all along, us realizing coal plants are...
Well, we've realized it over and over again, right, in the United States and the history. I mean, we had the energy crisis in the 70s, and that's when, in Western Mass, a lot of people put up solar installations. They had solar hot water. Representative Kulik was a circuit rider going around promoting clean energy and energy efficiency in the 70s, and now we relearned it again. So it's an up and down, just like most things in history. We've committed and then we've gone back. When oil is cheap, you know, when things are inexpensive, it's easy to get settled and do what's easy. But now we have a greater awareness and we're moving forward.
You know, I mean, I guess I can't sit here any longer than that, but I mean, you know, when Governor Patrick really went and joined the Reggie states and put together the Global Warming Solution Act and had extremely strong partners in the legislature, and quite frankly, the biggest one is sitting right here with us. And it's going to be a great loss when he leaves the legislature, particularly on issues of energy and the environment. But those were bold steps that were taken and really set, you know, what is now almost a decade-long course in the realization that not only was this good for the environment, and not only was it good for energy, but it was also good for our economy, and really, you know, moving Massachusetts forward, you know, well into the future, not just during any administration. And in absolute fairness, you know, Governor Baker has taken that and moved forward. He, you know, has filed the hydro bill, which I did have the opportunity to go and support. So it's crossing party lines, but a real recognition of staying true to the Global Warming Solution Act plan and to the clean energy agenda.
Do you notice any pushback from the state Senate when it comes to proposing these types of, you know, efforts to move forward in having a greener Massachusetts?
No, I really don't think so. I think there will be debates about how we do it, but there's not a debate about if we ought to do it. And that's the good thing about the debate in Massachusetts. And that is in no small part thanks to the political leadership of Governor Patrick and the team that he and Rick put together, but it's also the partnerships that were established. In many other states, those were political fights between administrations and utilities and other groups, right? Here in Massachusetts, it's been about a partnership. Yeah, there's been disagreements along the way, and there ought to be disagreements on how we get there, but broadly speaking, everyone has agreed on advancing that agenda, and I think that has been critically important, and I think we need to continue to build on it. That's the most important thing. We can't rest on our laurels and say, well, we're better than 49 other states. Well, those 49 other states on the whole aren't all that good. Being better than bad can't be good enough. We need to build on the progress that we've made and continue to move forward. And I think the math and science have always been there when it comes to climate and when it comes to the environment. What we need to continue to have is the political leadership to move us forward, the partnership with utilities, partnerships with municipalities, to be able to get the most out of the programs that we put in place.
And on that message, we actually have to wrap it up. That was a wonderful discussion. Thank you all very much. We'll have the last word for you right after the break. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today's program has been dedicated to learning about what green, sustainable, and renewable energy is and the long-term plans for the future of energy in Massachusetts. So that's our program for today. We want to thank our guests for joining us for this very interesting discussion, and thanks to you at home for watching. If you missed any of this, you can watch it in full on our website at wwlp.com. And from all of us here at 22 News, we wish you a wonderful Sunday.